Agent Jamila Scott was used to long hours on the road. She had been a part of the FBI for years, handling complex cases and serving her country with dedication. Today, she was heading to a small town just outside the city. She'd been given a task to investigate a potential case of fraud, something she had done many times before. Her car hummed steadily along the highway, and as the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the quiet streets, Jamila noticed the slow pace of the town. It was peaceful here, a stark contrast to the bustling city life she was used to. The buildings were simple and old, the streets less crowded, and the air smelled fresher. But what caught her attention wasn't the calm of the town. It was the police car parked by the side of the road. She had seen it before, but today, it felt like the officer inside was watching her more closely. As she passed, the police lights suddenly flashed on. Jamila immediately signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. It wasn't unusual to be stopped for a routine check, especially on unfamiliar roads. She reached for her badge in her bag and got ready to identify herself when the officer stepped out of his car. The officer, a tall man with a sharp jawline and a hardened expression, approached her vehicle. He had a no-nonsense look on his face. Jamila rolled down her window and greeted him with a professional smile. She didn't expect the conversation to take a strange turn. "Good evening, officer," Jamila said calmly, holding up her FBI badge for him to see. The officer's eyes didn't soften. Instead, his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. Jamila had been stopped by officers many times, but there was something in this one's demeanor that made her uncomfortable. Still, she remained calm, knowing that her credentials would clear any misunderstanding. "Let me see your ID," he demanded abruptly, his tone flat and serious. Jamila was confused at first. She had shown her badge, but she didn't question it. She handed him her driver's license, wondering if the officer was just being thorough. However, as he glanced at her ID, his eyes narrowed slightly, and he looked at her again, this time with suspicion in his eyes. "FBI. Huh," he said slowly, his words dripping with doubt. "You don't look like one of them." Jamila's smile faded slightly. She had worked hard to get where she was in the FBI, and it wasn't the first time someone had questioned her qualifications because of her appearance. Still, she didn't let it get to her. "I assure you, officer, I am who I say I am. I'm here on official business." The officer didn't seem convinced. "Yeah. What's a woman like you doing out here alone, in the middle of nowhere?" His voice was laced with judgment. Jamila kept her composure. "I'm investigating the case for the FBI. If you'd like, I can call my supervisor to verify it." The officer ignored her offer, instead staring at her with a look that made her feel as if she were being sized up in a way that wasn't about her credentials. "I don't trust people who don't look like they belong here," he muttered, almost to himself. She tried to stay professional. "Officer, I'm here to do my job, just like you are. I'd like to get on my way if everything checks out." But the officer's expression hardened. Without saying anything else, he stepped back, speaking into his radio. Jamila felt her patience beginning to wear thin. She had been in law enforcement long enough to know when someone wasn't interested in doing their job the right way. The officer's response wasn't about procedure anymore. It was something personal. A few moments later, he returned to her window, his tone more firm than before. "Step out of the car." Jamila's eyes widened in surprise. "What? Why?" "You're being arrested," the officer announced bluntly, almost as if it were routine. "Arrested?" Jamila's voice remained calm, but she could feel the shift in the air. She couldn't believe what was happening. "For what?" "You're a fraud," he said simply. "A fake FBI agent. I'll be taking you in." Jamila shook her head, her mind racing. This couldn't be happening. She was in shock, trying to comprehend the sudden twist of events. "This is ridiculous," she said, trying to reason with him. "I have my badge, my ID, and I'm here on official business. You can call my supervisor." But the officer wasn't listening anymore. His demeanor was no longer professional. It was almost like he was looking for an excuse, any excuse, to escalate the situation. He was too far gone in his prejudice to consider reason. He moved to pull open her car door. "Get out now," he ordered. With a sigh, Jamila slowly opened the door and stepped out. She had no idea what was going on, but she wasn't going to fight him. She knew better than to escalate things further, especially when an officer was already this set on making her a target. As the officer handcuffed her, Jamila felt the sting of humiliation. She had worked hard to earn her place in the FBI, and now, in front of this officer, she was being treated like a criminal. It didn't matter how many years of training and hard work had gotten her here. None of that mattered in this moment. The officer's actions felt like a punch to the gut. As Jamila stood there, handcuffed and confused, the officer's actions began to sink in. The situation felt surreal. How had things gone from a simple traffic stop to her being arrested? She was calm, even as the cold metal cuffs tightened around her wrists. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. She had followed all the procedures, identified herself as an FBI agent, and tried to explain the situation. But none of that seemed to matter to Officer Thompson. "Move it," he grumbled, jerking her forward as he led her toward his patrol car. Jamila tried to remain calm, though a wave of frustration bubbled inside her. This wasn't just about being stopped. It was about something deeper, something rooted in the officer's judgment of her before he had even bothered to listen. She was certain that if she had been anyone else, anyone who didn't look like her, this wouldn't have happened. The officer didn't seem to care. He shoved her into the back of the squad car, slamming the door behind her without a word. Inside the small, confined space, Jamila sat silently, her wrists still bound by the handcuffs. The weight of the situation felt heavy, but she didn't let it show on her face. Her training had taught her to stay composed under pressure. She knew that panicking would get her nowhere. The ride to the station was quiet, the only sound the hum of the car's engine. Jamila couldn't help but think about how quickly everything had turned. She had been on her way to solve a case, and now she was being treated like a criminal. She had dealt with prejudice before in her career, but it had never felt like this. This was different. This was an officer of the law who was determined to make her a target, and he wasn't going to back down. As the car pulled into the police station, Jamila's thoughts turned to her colleagues. She had to get in touch with them. She had to make them understand what was happening. Her phone, however, was in the front seat, and the officer hadn't bothered to give it back to her. She could only hope that someone, anyone, would realize that something was wrong and come to her aid. When they arrived at the station, the officer opened the door and pulled her out of the car. He marched her inside, his grip on her arm firm. Jamila didn't resist. There was no point. She needed to keep her composure and find a way to resolve this. If she had learned anything during her time in the FBI, it was that the best way to handle a difficult situation was to stay calm and think through her options. The station was small, with the walls lined with pictures of local events and the faint smell of coffee in the air. There was a desk at the front where a couple of officers sat, glancing up as Jamila and Officer Thompson entered. They looked at her with curiosity, but there was no sympathy in their eyes. She could already tell that they had made their judgments about her. The officer who had arrested her didn't waste any time. "This one's a fraud," he said, his voice loud enough for the others to hear. "Thought she could get away with pretending to be FBI. I'm taking her in." The officers behind the desk didn't question him. They simply nodded and went back to their work. Jamila's heart sank. She had hoped for at least a little understanding, a little respect, but it seemed as though the officer's word was enough to seal her fate. She wasn't going to get any help here. The officer walked her to a holding cell at the back of the station. It was a small room with a single cot and a metal bench. He shoved her inside and slammed the door behind her. Jamila stood there for a moment, her breath steady, as she tried to gather her thoughts. She couldn't let this break her. She knew that if she let her emotions take over, she wouldn't be able to think clearly. She needed to make a plan. Her mind immediately went to her supervisor, Agent Elijah Waters. He would know what to do. Jamila had worked with Elijah for years, and he had always been a mentor to her. She trusted him, and she knew he wouldn't let this go unnoticed. She had to get in touch with him. But there was no phone in the cell. She had no way to contact him, no way to alert anyone that she needed help. She was trapped in this small room, and all she could do was wait. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one feeling like an eternity. She tried to keep her thoughts focused, telling herself that she would get through this. She had to. Outside the cell, she could hear the sounds of officers moving about. Some of them spoke in hushed tones, while others laughed and joked. Jamila tried not to let their voices affect her. She had been in tough situations before, but this felt different. The fact that she was in this holding cell, unjustly accused, was starting to sink in. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, alone, handcuffed, and trapped. Just as she was about to lose herself in her thoughts, the door to her cell opened. She looked up, half expecting it to be Officer Thompson, returning to make her life even more difficult. But instead, another officer stood in the doorway. This one looked different, taller, with a calm and authoritative presence. "I'm here to speak to Agent Scott," the officer said, his voice firm but respectful. Jamila stood up quickly, trying to push the feelings of hopelessness aside. She straightened her posture, ready for whatever came next. "I'm Agent Scott," she said, her voice steady. The officer nodded. "We've been contacted by your department. We'll be getting you out of here shortly." Relief washed over her, but Jamila remained cautious. She knew this wasn't over yet. She still had to deal with the aftermath of what had happened, but for now, she would take this small victory. At least now, someone was on her side. The cold, sterile air of the holding cell began to feel suffocating as Jamila sat on the metal bench. She had been waiting for what felt like hours, but in reality, it had only been a short time since the officer left her there. Her mind was swirling with questions. How could this happen to her? She had been doing her job. Nothing more, nothing less. But somehow, Officer Thompson had decided to arrest her without even giving her a chance to prove who she was. When the door finally opened, Jamila stood up quickly. She didn't know who to expect this time. She hadn't heard any voices outside the cell, no footsteps approaching. For a moment, she feared that perhaps she was forgotten, left in the holding cell indefinitely. But then, a new figure appeared in the doorway. It was an officer, but not one she recognized. He was taller than most, his uniform neat and professional, his face serious but not unfriendly. There was a calm authority about him, something that immediately put Jamila at ease, even if just a little. This was someone who was taking her situation seriously. "I'm here to speak with Agent Jamila Scott," the officer said with a slight nod. "That's me," Jamila replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. She wasn't sure what to expect next, but she knew this might be her chance to fix things, to get out of this mess. The officer stepped into the room, and Jamila could see that he wasn't like the others. He didn't look at her with suspicion, but with an air of professionalism that made her feel like she wasn't just a suspect, but a person who deserved respect. "I've been informed that you're with the FBI," the officer continued, his voice firm but kind. "We've received word from your department, and you'll be released shortly." Relief washed over Jamila, but it didn't last long. She still had to process everything that had happened. She had been unjustly arrested, humiliated, and treated like a criminal when she knew she was innocent. She had no idea what would happen to Officer Thompson or the other officers at the station. But for now, the only thing that mattered was that she was getting out. "I appreciate that," Jamila said quietly, trying to hide the exhaustion in her voice. "But what about him?" She glanced toward the door, the officer she had been forced to deal with. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. She needed to know what would happen to the officer who had done this to her, the one who had made up his mind about her from the moment he saw her. The new officer, who introduced himself as Officer Daniels, looked thoughtful for a moment. He didn't rush to answer, as if weighing his words carefully. "We'll be looking into the circumstances of your arrest," he said finally. "But for now, it's important that we get you back to your team. They've been waiting to hear from you." Jamila nodded. It wasn't the answer she was hoping for, but it was enough for now. She couldn't let herself focus on revenge or anger. She had to stay focused on getting back to her work. She had a job to do, and the case she was here to investigate was still waiting for her. As Officer Daniels escorted Jamila out of the holding area, she couldn't help but notice how different this officer was from the one who had arrested her. He spoke to her with respect, with the understanding that she was someone who deserved to be treated fairly. She couldn't help but wonder if this was how things should have been all along. Maybe it wasn't just about the badge or the uniform. It was about how people treated one another. When they reached the front desk, Jamila was met with the sound of whispers. She could feel the eyes of the other officers on her, some of them looking away quickly, embarrassed, while others couldn't seem to look at her at all. There was a sense of unease in the air, and Jamila realized that, despite what had happened, the atmosphere had shifted. The officers here were starting to see her not as a threat, but as someone who had been wronged. The power of her calm demeanor, her refusal to back down, was starting to have an effect. Officer Daniels handled the paperwork quickly, not wasting any time. Jamila didn't want to stay here any longer than necessary. The sooner she was back in her own vehicle, the sooner she could leave this small town behind. She was ready to move on, to find answers and continue her investigation. She had a job to do, and she wasn't going to let one officer's prejudice stop her. As they stepped outside, the cool evening air hit Jamila's face, and for the first time since the incident began, she felt a small sense of freedom. She was no longer trapped inside those cold walls, no longer in handcuffs. The streets outside were calm, the quiet hum of the town settling around her. But she couldn't forget the injustice she had just faced. No matter how peaceful the town looked, she knew it wasn't over. Officer Thompson might have made his mistake, but Jamila wasn't going to let him get away with it. She would make sure that what had happened would not be forgotten. "I'll be in touch with your supervisor soon," Officer Daniels said as he handed her back her belongings. "But for now, you're free to go." Jamila nodded, grateful but determined. "Thank you," she said, then added with quiet resolve, "I'll be sure to follow up on this." As she walked toward her car, Jamila's thoughts turned back to the case at hand. She had been delayed, humiliated, and wronged. But she knew this wouldn't stop her. It was just another challenge, another step in her journey as an agent. She had seen the worst of people before, but she had also seen the best. And as she started her car and drove off into the night, Jamila knew she would continue to fight for justice, no matter what it took. Jamila drove away from the police station with a mixture of relief and frustration weighing heavily on her. The town was still peaceful, but it felt different now. She couldn't shake the thought of what had happened. She had been falsely arrested, humiliated, and treated like a criminal just because of her appearance. But she wasn't one to let things slide. She couldn't, especially not when it came to something as serious as this. Her mind was racing as she navigated the quiet streets. She needed to take action, and she needed to do it fast. The first thing on her list was to get in touch with her supervisor, Agent Elijah Waters. Elijah was someone she trusted, someone who would know what to do in this situation. He had always been a steady presence in her career, guiding her through tough cases and difficult situations. She knew that he would take her seriously and would help her get to the bottom of this. As she reached for her phone, she realized that it had been in the front seat the entire time, and the officer who had arrested her hadn't bothered to return it. Jamila let out a deep sigh, frustrated once again. She pulled into a gas station a few blocks away to make the call. The lights of the station flickered in the distance, a quiet beacon in the otherwise dark streets. The call connected after a few rings. Elijah's voice came through the line, calm and reassuring as always. "Jamila, where are you?" "I've been trying to reach you," he said, his tone filled with concern. "I'm fine," she replied, trying to sound as steady as possible. "But I've got a situation on my hands." Elijah immediately picked up on the tension in her voice. What happened? Jamila explained everything. The traffic stop, the officer's unwarranted arrest, the way she had been treated. She didn't leave out any details. She was direct and honest, wanting Elijah to understand just how serious this was. "I'm sorry, Jamila," Elijah said after a long pause. "That's completely unacceptable. You're lucky it didn't escalate further. I'll make sure we get this sorted out." Jamila appreciated his words, but she wasn't satisfied just yet. "I don't just want this sorted out, Elijah. I want to make sure this officer faces consequences for what he did. No one should be treated like that." Elijah was quiet for a moment. She could tell he was thinking it over. "I agree with you. This isn't just a case of incompetence. It's something deeper, and it needs to be addressed. I'll start working on it right away. Don't worry. We'll make sure this gets the attention it deserves." Jamila felt a weight lift off her shoulders, but the relief didn't last long. She knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, especially with a small-town police department. The officer who had arrested her wasn't going to back down easily, and Jamila wasn't sure what kind of support she could expect from the rest of the force. "I appreciate your help, Elijah," Jamila said, her voice steady again. "But I need to get back to my investigation. There's still work to be done. I can't let this delay me." Elijah chuckled softly, as if he understood exactly how Jamila worked. "I know you, Jamila, but don't do anything rash. You've been through enough today. Let us handle this." "I will," she replied, even though she wasn't sure how much she could stand by and wait. There was something about injustice that ignited a fire in her. She couldn't just sit back and wait for others to act. After hanging up, Jamila took a deep breath. She still had a case to solve, and she knew that the sooner she got back on track, the better. She had to push aside the anger and frustration bubbling inside her. She had to focus on the bigger picture. It wasn't just about Officer Thompson and his actions. It was about the case that had brought her here in the first place. The fraud investigation was still on her mind, and she knew she had to finish what she started. Jamila pulled back onto the road, the hum of the engine comforting as she moved away from the gas station and into the night. The lights from the city in the distance began to grow brighter as she drove, but they didn't offer much comfort. She still felt the weight of what had happened. She knew that the road ahead would be filled with obstacles, both in her investigation and in her efforts to hold Officer Thompson accountable. Her mind kept returning to that moment in the holding cell, when she had sat alone, feeling powerless, and then to the officer who had shown her no respect. She had faced discrimination before, but this was different. This wasn't just about her personal experience. It was about the system. Jamila wasn't naive enough to think this was an isolated incident. There were deeper issues at play, and she couldn't ignore them. But for now, she had to focus on her case. The drive felt long, the weight of the day pressing down on her. As Jamila finally neared her destination, she couldn't help but reflect on the anger that still burned inside her. She had to stay focused, but the fire was there, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. She would get to the bottom of this fraud case, and when the time came, she would make sure Officer Thompson faced the consequences of his actions. She wouldn't let this go. Jamila turned the corner, the familiar sight of her destination coming into view. Her mind cleared as she focused on the task at hand. She was ready. This was far from over, but Jamila Scott was determined to finish what she started. By the time Jamila reached her destination, the anger she had been carrying had begun to simmer down, replaced by a quiet resolve. She pulled into the parking lot of the local FBI office, her mind still filled with thoughts of Officer Thompson and the ordeal she had just been through. But now, her focus shifted to the task ahead. She had a case to solve, and she wasn't going to let anything, or anyone, distract her. As she stepped out of the car and walked into the building, she was greeted by the usual sounds of a busy office. Phones rang in the background, agents moved about, and the hum of activity was a welcome contrast to the chaos of the past few hours. Jamila headed straight to her desk, ready to get back to work, but the moment she sat down, She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She pulled out her phone and checked for any new messages. To her surprise, there was a message from Agent Elijah Waters, the one person she knew she could trust. His message was short and to the point. "Meet me in the conference room as soon as you arrive. I've got news." Jamila's heart skipped a beat. She knew Elijah well enough to recognize when something was important. He was always calm and measured, but when he wanted to speak with her directly, it usually meant there was something big at play. She didn't waste any time. Standing up, she grabbed her things and headed down the hallway to the conference room. When she opened the door, she found Elijah sitting at the table, a stack of papers in front of him. He looked up and gave her a small nod, indicating for her to sit down. "Jamila," he started, his voice serious. "I've spoken with the higher-ups about what happened. They're taking this seriously. They're starting an internal review, but it's going to take some time. In the meantime, I wanted to make sure you had all the information you needed to keep moving forward with your case." Jamila nodded, her thoughts focused on the investigation she had come to finish. The fraud case she had been working on had already taken a backseat, but now, with Elijah's confirmation that action was being taken against Officer Thompson, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. "So, what's next?" Jamila asked, eager to move forward and finish the work she had set out to do. Elijah slid a file across the table toward her. "Here's what we've got so far. We've tracked down the people who've been involved in the fraudulent activities, but it's going to be tricky to get them to talk. They're careful, too careful. This isn't going to be an easy case, but I know you can handle it." Jamila picked up the file, flipping through the pages. The case was complex, multiple layers of deception, involving people from different industries. But that was nothing new for Jamila. She had worked on complicated cases before. What troubled her wasn't the case itself. It was the underlying tension of having to deal with the fallout from her arrest, the frustration of having to balance both at once. "I'll get to work on this," she said, her voice steady. "But Elijah, I need to know. What's being done about Officer Thompson? I can't just let this go." Elijah leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "I know, Jamila, and I agree with you." He crossed a line. "I've made sure this doesn't get swept under the rug, but it's a slow process. You know how these things go. For now, the best thing we can do is keep moving forward on both fronts. Handle the case, and we'll deal with Thompson when the time is right." Jamila let out a deep breath. She didn't like the idea of waiting, but Elijah was right. There was a process, and jumping ahead of it wouldn't help anyone. It was just hard to ignore the feeling that she had been wronged, that the system had failed her, but she couldn't let that cloud her judgment. She had a job to do. "All right," Jamila said, determined. "I'll focus on the case, but I'm not letting up on Thompson. I'll stay on top of it." Elijah gave her a small smile. "I wouldn't expect anything less from you. You're one of the best we got, Jamila, and I've got your back, every step of the way." Jamila appreciated his words, but she knew she couldn't rely on others to make things right. She had to fight for herself, just like she had fought for her place in the FBI. She had spent years earning respect, proving herself in a field that wasn't always kind to women, especially women of color. This wasn't just about Officer Thompson. It was about a system that often treated her like she didn't belong, no matter how much she proved she was capable. After a few more minutes of discussing the details of the case, Jamila left the conference room, her mind clear. She was ready. This wasn't just about finding the criminals involved in the fraud. It was about proving that she wouldn't be held back, no matter what. She would solve this case, and she would make sure that Officer Thompson's actions didn't go unpunished. As she sat back down at her desk and started reviewing the files, Jamila couldn't help but think about how far she had come. She was no longer the unsure rookie who had first walked through the doors of the FBI. She was stronger, more focused, and no matter what challenges lay ahead, she knew she would face them head-on. The next few days were a blur for Jamila. She threw herself into the case, working long hours at the office, poring over files, and making calls to people connected to the fraud scheme. The case was more complicated than she had initially realized, with layers of deception carefully crafted by a group of individuals who knew how to cover their tracks. But Jamila wasn't deterred. She had seen worse, and she was determined to crack this case wide open. As the days passed, Jamila found herself thinking less about Officer Thompson and more about the fraud investigation. The anger she had felt in the beginning started to fade as she focused on the task at hand. She couldn't afford to let her emotions cloud her judgment, especially now that she was this close to solving the case. But deep down, she couldn't forget what had happened. She had been arrested, humiliated, and treated as if her badge meant nothing. That kind of injustice didn't just disappear. One afternoon, after an intense morning of interviews and phone calls, Jamila received a call that immediately caught her attention. It was from Agent Elijah Waters. "Jamila, we've got some updates on Officer Thompson." Elijah's voice came through the phone, calm but urgent. "I think we're getting closer to figuring out how far this goes." Jamila's heart skipped a beat. She had been waiting for this moment, but hearing it in Elijah's voice made it real. "What have you found?" she asked, her voice steady despite the sudden rush of adrenaline. "We've been able to pull some records, and it turns out Officer Thompson has a history. Nothing formal, but there are patterns," Elijah explained. "It's not just this one incident. It looks like he's been involved in questionable behavior for a while. We're putting together a case on him now, but it's going to take a little time." Jamila nodded, though Elijah couldn't see her. "I'm glad to hear that. But we can't wait forever. We need action." "I know," Elijah replied. "We'll move as quickly as we can. But for now, keep focusing on your case. I'll make sure you're in the loop as soon as we have more." Jamila's fingers drummed against the desk as she processed what Elijah had said. She was glad to hear that action was being taken, but the waiting was unbearable. She had been wronged, and she wasn't about to let it slide. She had to be patient, but that didn't mean she couldn't take matters into her own hands in the meantime. There was still work to do, and she was determined to finish what she started. That evening, as Jamila sat in her office reviewing the case files, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message from one of her contacts in the local police department. The message was short, but to the point. "Thompson's behavior isn't just limited to the town. We've received reports from multiple officers in different precincts. It's time to take action." Jamila's pulse quickened. This was the break she needed. It wasn't just one officer with a bias. It was part of a larger problem. Officer Thompson was a part of something bigger, something that needed to be exposed. She read the message again, her mind racing with the possibilities. This wasn't just about her. This was about making sure that no one else had to go through what she had experienced. Without wasting any time, Jamila picked up the phone and dialed Elijah's number again. He picked up on the first ring. "Jamila, what's up?" Elijah's voice was calm, but she could tell he was on edge too. They both knew this was a turning point. "I've got more information," Jamila said, her voice steady, but filled with purpose. "Thompson isn't the only one. There are reports coming in from other precincts. It's not just one officer. It's a whole network of them. We need to take action, and we need to do it now." Elijah's silence on the other end of the line was brief, but Jamila knew he was processing the information. "This is big, Jamila," he said finally. "Are you sure about this?" "I'm sure," she replied without hesitation. "It's time to expose this. I've got everything I need to make it public, but I can't do this alone." "I've got your back," Elijah reassured her. "Let's do this the right way." Jamila felt a surge of determination. The more she thought about the injustice she had faced, the more certain she became that this was bigger than her personal experience. This wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about making sure that no one else faced the same kind of treatment. Officer Thompson's actions were just the beginning of something much larger, and Jamila knew she was in the perfect position to take it down. The next few days were a whirlwind of action. Jamila worked tirelessly, collecting more evidence, speaking with witnesses, and making sure everything was in order before they took the next step. Elijah and his team were working in the background, pulling records, speaking with officers, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. They knew that exposing this corruption would be difficult, but they also knew that it was necessary. As the pieces began to fall into place, Jamila could feel the weight of the situation settling in. She was about to confront a network of officers who had been hiding their actions for far too long. But she wasn't afraid. She had faced challenges before, and she knew she could do this. This wasn't just about solving a case. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter how difficult it might be. The moment of truth was coming, and Jamila was ready. She had been through a lot, but she wasn't backing down now. She was going to make sure that justice was served, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. As the days went by, Jamila felt the pressure mounting. She was now fully immersed in the task of gathering evidence for both the fraud case and the misconduct involving Officer Thompson. It felt like her mind was constantly racing, balancing two major investigations at once. Each task demanded her full attention, and she couldn't afford to slip up. But no matter how hard she worked, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something bigger was at play, something that might be even more complicated than she had originally thought. She had spent countless hours reviewing records, speaking with witnesses, and piecing together the fraudulent activities she had been sent to investigate. The more she dug, the more layers of deception she uncovered. This wasn't a small-time operation. It was widespread, touching multiple sectors, and there were people involved who had enough power to cover their tracks for years. But Jamila had seen people like this before. She knew how to navigate through the lies, how to expose the truth, no matter how well it was hidden. At the same time, she was working closely with Elijah to gather more information on Officer Thompson and the network of officers who had been involved in questionable activities. The reports that Jamila had received from her contacts in other precincts confirmed that this was no isolated incident. Officer Thompson wasn't just a bad apple. He was part of a much larger issue within the department. Jamila knew that exposing this network wasn't going to be easy, but it was the right thing to do. One afternoon, Jamila sat at her desk, sifting through the latest set of documents when her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and saw Elijah's name. Her heart skipped a beat, knowing that whatever news he had for her, it was likely going to be big. "Jamila, it's time," Elijah said as soon as she answered the phone. His voice was filled with urgency. "We've gathered enough evidence. We're moving forward." Jamila's breath caught in her chest. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when they would finally expose the corruption that had been hiding in plain sight. She had to be ready. "Are you sure we have everything?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with determination. "We've got it all," Elijah replied. "We have the records, the reports from multiple officers, and enough evidence to bring down the entire network. It's time to act." Jamila's mind raced as she processed the information. She had spent weeks, no, months, working on this. It had started as a simple investigation, but now it had turned into something much more significant. She had a chance to make a real difference, not just for herself, but for the people who had been wronged by the officers in this network. "I'm ready," she said, her voice calm despite the rush of adrenaline coursing through her. She knew this wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way to make sure justice was done. "We'll need to make this public," Elijah continued. "We're planning to hold a press conference, and we want to make sure that every bit of this is revealed. It's time to shine a light on what's been happening." Jamila paused for a moment, taking in what Elijah had said. This wasn't just about catching the criminals. It was about making sure everyone knew the truth. It was about making sure that no one could ignore the corruption that had been allowed to fester for far too long. "I agree," Jamila said firmly. "We need to make this public, and we need to do it right." Elijah gave a small sigh of relief. "Good. I'll make sure everything is in place. We'll coordinate the press release and get the word out. This is going to change everything, Jamila." As Jamila hung up the phone, She felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. She had worked so hard to get to this point, and now everything was about to come to a head. She knew this wasn't going to be the end. There would be challenges ahead. There always were, but this was the moment she had been building toward. She had exposed the truth, and now it was time for the world to see it. Later that evening, Jamila sat down with Elijah and their team to go over the final details. They were all tired, but there was a sense of urgency in the air. They were preparing for the press conference that would change everything. Jamila knew this wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, for holding people accountable, and for making sure that no one else would be treated the way she had been. "I want to make sure we're clear on everything," Jamila said as she looked around the table at her colleagues. "We can't leave anything out. We need to make sure this is airtight." Elijah nodded. "We've got everything covered. The evidence is solid, and we're ready to take action." Jamila looked down at the stack of papers in front of her. She had seen the evidence, every email, every report, every piece of information that proved the corruption had spread far and wide. She had seen how people had been hurt, how lives had been affected by the greed and dishonesty of those in power. But now, they were going to fight back. They were going to expose the truth, and they were going to make sure that justice was served. The hours seemed to slip by as the team prepared for the big day. As Jamila went over her notes one last time, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had worked so hard to get here, and now she was about to take the final step. She wasn't just going to take down a few bad officers, she was going to change the system. And that, she knew, was just the beginning. The day of the press conference had arrived, and Jamila couldn't shake the nervous energy that was building inside her. She had spent weeks, maybe even months, preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, the weight of it all felt overwhelming. The room was buzzing with reporters, their cameras ready, notebooks in hand, all waiting for the big reveal. Jamila stood in the back of the room, taking a deep breath as she steadied herself. She wasn't just about to reveal the truth. She was about to make a statement that would echo far beyond this room. Elijah stood beside her, his usual calm demeanor offering her a sense of comfort. "You've got this, Jamila," he said quietly. "The truth is on your side." She nodded, feeling a mix of gratitude and anxiety. "I just want to make sure this goes right." "You've already done the hard part," Elijah said. "Now, all we have to do is speak the truth. Let them hear it." With those words, Jamila stepped up to the podium, the bright lights of the room flashing on her. The cameras clicked as the room fell silent. Jamila felt the weight of the moment, but she stood tall, her gaze steady. She had spent years working to get here, and she wasn't about to back down now. She had a story to tell, a story that needed to be heard. "Good afternoon," Jamila began, her voice firm and clear. "I stand before you today to bring to light a truth that has been hidden for far too long. The investigation that I have been a part of is not just about uncovering a fraudulent scheme. It's about exposing the corruption that has seeped into the very institutions meant to protect us." The room was still, the reporters hanging on her every word. Jamila could feel the weight of their attention, but it didn't faze her. She continued, her words flowing with confidence now. "For months, I have been investigating a network of individuals involved in fraudulent activities. What started as a simple case has turned into something much bigger, something that reaches further than anyone could have imagined. But this isn't just about a few bad actors trying to make a quick profit. This is about a system that allowed them to operate without consequence. It's about a culture that turned a blind eye to misconduct." Jamila paused, letting the gravity of her words sink in. She could see the reporters scribbling notes, their eyes wide with attention. She knew that what she was saying was important, not just for the case, but for everyone who had ever been let down by those in power. "The person who first crossed my path in this investigation, Officer Thompson, was not an isolated incident. He was part of a larger network of officers who used their positions to manipulate, deceive, and exploit those who trusted them. What happened to me was not an isolated case, and it was not an accident. It was the result of a system that turned its back on justice. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Jamila could feel the tension in the room, but she didn't break. She knew she had to continue. "But this is not the end," she said, her voice growing stronger. "This is just the beginning. We are committed to holding everyone involved accountable. Officer Thompson's actions were just the tip of the iceberg. We will continue to investigate and expose every person who allowed this corruption to continue. Justice will be served, and no one will be above the law." As she finished speaking, there was a moment of silence before the reporters began to ask questions. Jamila was ready for them, her mind clear, her resolve firm. She answered each question with confidence, laying out the evidence, explaining the process, and reaffirming her commitment to seeing this through. Despite the tension, she could feel a sense of relief beginning to settle over her. She had done it. She had told the truth, and now there was no turning back. The room buzzed with energy, the reporters eager to get the story out. Jamila knew this was the moment when everything would change, not just for her, but for the entire department, for the people who had been wronged, and for the system that needed to be reformed. After the press conference, Jamila stood outside the building, taking in a deep breath of fresh air. The adrenaline from speaking in front of so many people was still rushing through her veins, but now, as she stood there, it felt like a weight had been lifted. The truth was out there, and now it was in the hands of the public. Elijah walked up beside her, a small smile on his face. "You did great, Jamila," he said. "You told them what needed to be said." Jamila smiled back, but it was a smile of relief, not triumph. "It's not over yet," she said. "There's still work to be done. The fight isn't over." Elijah nodded. "No, it's not. But you've made a difference today. You've started something that can't be ignored. And I know that no matter what happens, you'll keep fighting for what's right." Jamila looked out at the city, the sun beginning to set on the horizon. There was still so much to do, but she felt a sense of purpose now, stronger than ever before. She had fought for justice, and she had won a small victory. But this was just the beginning. She wasn't done yet. She would keep fighting, no matter how long it took, for herself, for the people who had been wronged, and for the justice that was long overdue.